Hello and welcome. My name is Dilly Linda. I'm the Communications Lead in Highways for Skanska. Welcome to our session, Is Our Carbon Wallet Empty? I'll be talking to the members of the Infrastructure Net Zero Carbon Coalition to discuss their work in the future of carbon and in particularly the embedded carbon in the infrastructure pipeline. Today I have with me Ruth Finlayson, who is the Environment and Carbon Manager at Skanska and the Project Manager for this workstream. We also have Dominic Burbridge, Associate Director with the Carbon Trust, heading up infrastructure and construction sector work. And we have Dr. Yannick Giescom. He's a research fellow in industrial climate change policy with the University of Leeds. We also have Natalie Francis. She's the senior carbon consultant within McDonald. And we have David Mason, who's technical director within Skanska, specialising in carbon. And Stacey Collins, who's a partner and energy and infrastructure projects lawyer with Pinsent Masons. So Ruth, can you tell me what the Net Zero Coalition is, and actually what is embodied carbon in the infrastructure project?
Hi. The Coalition, we're a group of organisations and companies who work in the infrastructure sector, and we've all come together wanting to use our collective carbon knowledge and experience to deliver and operate the infrastructure that we need, and to help support the progression of infrastructure whilst achieving our net zero ambitions. So achieving net zero emissions in the UK by 2050 is quite a big goal, and it will require significant change in the way that we plan, build and operate our infrastructure. So we really need to mobilise the best of UK's expertise in carbon to collaborate and work together to achieve this goal. The UK was the first major economy to legislate for such an ambitious climate change target. It's consistent with the global effort needed to keep the temperature rise to much less than 2 degrees in line with the Paris Agreement. Otherwise, the wider effects of climate change, flooding, storm events, warmer weather, coastal erosion, all of these have a significant ability to impact our infrastructure in the way that we live. So the objective of this project was to research and evaluate the potential embodied carbon of the infrastructure pipeline looking out towards 2050. So those projects we already know that we need to do to develop our infrastructure to keep moving forward. When we're looking at embedded carbon, we're talking about materials, resources, energy, emissions, all of those things required to facilitate the operation of our network. And there's the big amount of carbon spend that we know that we've committed to. That all comes out of our UK budget. So it's really important to manage the impact, so we understand what we're committing to build, how we're going to build it, and make sure that we're not jeopardising future generations or impacting the climate too much.
So Ruth, why is this important? Actually, Dominic, we're going to come to you. Why is this important, and what does it mean to climate change in the industry?
Yeah, I think to really understand why it's important, the first thing to do is to start to take like a whole life view of infrastructure. So what we mean by that is you've got to look at the whole life cycle. So everything from the embedded carbon that we just talked about, the embodied carbon, all the way through to the operational carbon. So that's the carbon used in actually making the infrastructure work. And then we've got to look at user carbon. So all these are laid out in PAS 2080 defined, but user carbon is then how that infrastructure is used by individuals. So to give an example, if we look at a road, then you've obviously got the embodied carbon is all the tarmac and the concrete and the steel that goes into manufacturing the roads. Then the user carbon would be, say, the street lighting. So relatively small in terms of the operational carbon would be the street lighting. And then the last bit, the user carbon, would be the cars on the road. So if we take this whole life view, then what we've seen over the last few years is that with efforts around energy efficiency, sourcing renewable energy, fuel switching, so things like obviously electrification or even the move to a hydrogen economy for heat and transport. And if you look at that, then user carbon and operational carbon is coming down. And the sector is doing some quite good work in that. But as that comes down, the amount of embodied carbon is growing. So this capital carbon that we refer to in PAS 2080 is growing. So, as an organisation, we wanted, as the coalition, we wanted to shine a light on that capital carbon. and to get a feel of, how big is it, and how well is the current pipeline of projects that we've got planned in the next 10 years, £600 billion spent, how well are we actually measuring that capital carbon? And I guess the theory is that once we've got a really good baseline, then we can set targets. People can get behind that. And then the fundamental thing, coming back to Ruth's point, which is really important, is then once we've got this baseline, we've got reduction targets, we can avoid the lock-in of a wasteful amount of that capital carbon and the UK's share of the remaining global carbon budget. So let's shine a light on it, and then let's reduce it and not waste that budget.
That's really interesting. But how is the budget quantified, and how does that feed into the transport and infrastructure? How do the targets feed into that?
So we started with the quantification was basically to look at that pipeline of projects, and then really just go around, start engaging with people and say, what have you done to measure the embodied carbon, and start building that picture from the bottom up.
Yeah, because there's something you want to add there as well about those targets.
Now, back in 2013, the Treasury published this document, the Infrastructure Carbon Review, that was quite influential in changing a lot of parts of how the industry addresses carbon. So a lot of the terminology that Dominic's just mentioned, for instance, originally stemmed from that report. There were 70 plus organisational signatories that signed up to commitments as a result of it and changed their practices. But what that report also tries to do was set out a baseline of emissions from infrastructure assets in the UK in terms of the capital, operational and user carbon associated with energy, waste, telecoms, transport, and water assets. So these 5 major economic infrastructure sectors. So what they tried to do with that was set out a baseline for 2010. And of course, in those 7 years since then, quite a lot has changed. We've had the things that Ruth and Dominic mentioned, like the Paris Agreement, but we've also had big transformations in our energy infrastructure assets and so on. So what we've been doing recently is going back and updating the data behind that and trying to work out what's happened in those intervening 7 years. And the good news from that is, as Dominic alluded to there, we have seen reductions in infrastructure carbon over that period between 2010 and 2018. So we got an overall reduction of about 23% in the carbon emissions from infrastructure. It's important to put in context that that's around about half of our carbon footprint in the UK is associated with the use of those infrastructure assets in those 5 key sectors. So a 23% reduction in that is really significant. It's an even bigger reduction if we just think about the parts that are directly under control of the infrastructure industry. So if we think about the capital and operational carbon, that's gone down by about 44% over that time period. The only sector that's kind of bucked the trend, though, out of those 5 that I've mentioned is transport, where emissions have actually increased by about 4% over that time period. And as Dominic's mentioned, we have seen some progress, things like street lighting, emissions associated with that going down. But use carb's gone up and capital carbon's also gone up. Now that user carbon, we've talked a lot, other parts in this conference about things like changes in vehicle sales towards battery electric vehicles and so on. Yep, 10% of the cars we sold last month came with a plug, but we're still 98% dependent on fossil fuels for our transport. And even when we're talking about that move towards battery electric vehicles, about a quarter of the ones we're selling are SUVs. So there's certainly a lot more we can do to reduce those user carbon emissions. But the part we're talking about today is really this capital carbon. We've seen a 60% increase in that across the infrastructure sector over this last decade. And it's imperative that we start talking more about what we can do to reduce that. Of course, that update on the Infrastructure Carbon Review was really a retrospective piece. That was looking at what's happened over the last 10 years. And what's really crucial about the work that the Net Zero Infrastructure Coalition is doing is looking at what we can do to influence emissions over the next 10 years and beyond. And that's why it's crucial that they're doing this kind of assessment of the National Infrastructure Pipeline and the Infrastructure and Projects Authority's pipeline.
So how
Dilly, sorry, just to smash across convention and stuff there. I was just going to say there's this really important thing to think about with capital carbon in that it's happening now, it's happening today, and it's locking in for the future. So you're using part of the budget of future infrastructure right away, but also we're making decisions today that are going forward for the next 5 to 10 years as well. So, you know, we really do have to get our focus on this to get the whole life sort of approach into sharp focus, so that we know what we're doing. Sorry for cutting across.
Well, that's a really good point there, David, because it is happening now, and we need to take note that, you know, change needs to happen now. We all need to be aware of it and how it affects us in our roles, because it does affect everybody. You know, but what I'd like to know is how did you scope out and decide the scope of the projects to include, and how did you start the methodology for such a variety of work in the sector? Natalie, is that something you could talk to us about?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dilly. So we approached this by looking at how do we look at the forecast of projects and do that kind of bottom-up assessment of embodied carbon. So we started from the Infrastructure Projects Authority, the IPA, which is a government body which publishes the forecast of infrastructure projects in the government pipeline. We used the 2018 version because that was the latest one available at the time when we started the project. So this is a list of just under 500 projects, and it captures a variety of information, including like a project description, expected timeline to date of service, capex, and a lot of other information. These were split into 6 major sectors, which covered communications, energy, flood, transport, utilities, and waste. And these were further split into a number of subsectors. So our methodology essentially was to try and find actual carbon data for as many of these projects as possible, and then calculate benchmarks to fill in the gaps. So as a coalition, we looked at projects we had direct access to. So what have we worked on? We covered, as a coalition, we cover consultants, contractors, asset owners. So between us, we'd worked on a number of these projects, and we had the embodied carbon data we needed. We also put out a data request to asset owners and to our wider networks, asking what carbon data they had available on their projects, information on scope, and major materials they could share. So, for example, if we had a rough high-level estimate of total concrete or steel, we could plug that into the Mott McDonald's carbon portal and look at what the carbon impact might be. And finally, we were looking at what information is available publicly, and this was through the Planning Inspectorate website. So we were looking at planning documents, so DCOs or environmental statements or anything similar, where information on the impacts of climate change provided. So that was our kind of methodology for that.
Just to add to that as well is that just from a timeline point of view, whilst we're looking at 2018, the projects were going on for the next 5 to 10 years. When we're looking at the DCO information, it's quite recent rather than historic. So there's a big difference in looking at the projected or the information that we actually hold on past projects as well. So it's a bit of looking at both of those.
Thank you for that. I mean, Stacey, in your opinion, why do you think the carbon data is so difficult to find in projects that have already passed through the planning system?
Yeah, certainly I can deal with that. Well, I suppose part of my legal practice consists of engaging with companies and government departments on developing decarbonisation strategies for major projects. So it's been great to work with the coalition to understand the challenge of obtaining, measuring and sharing embedded carbon data for infrastructure. Because I guess, in that respect, accounting for embedded carbon is a developing area, and the information available for new or existing projects is heavily dependent on their nature and their scale. There are many small and medium-sized projects for which there's just no embedded carbon data available, in part because there's no regulatory requirement to provide it. I think it's fair to say more information is generally available for larger projects, which proceed through the planning system and are subject to an environmental impact assessment, an EIA. That's because the EIA regulations require submissions on the climate impacts of new projects, and that obviously includes the carbon dioxide created as a result of them. Also, as with most planning related submissions, the EIA is for a new project is publicly available. So the planning system only requires carbon data for a limited number of new projects. So many can and do in permitted development, and that's, as you'll know, where new infrastructure can be built without having to seek planning permission. In addition, I guess even for new infrastructure where planning permission is required, most do not have to provide an EIA. which often means that you just can't get much carbon related data on those projects. So those projects that have limited or no scrutiny as regards their climate costs are probably going to have a significant carbon impact in terms of embedded carbon, and more generally, the issue is that you can't assess the exact scale of that impact because the data isn't there to allow it to be measured. As you'll know, where an EIA is required, the recent update 2017 to the regs now require relevant project to be considered in the context of the use of natural resources, the emission of pollutants, and most importantly, the impact of the project on climate, for example, the nature and magnitude of greenhouse gas emissions. But this is still a relatively new focus, and there's not really any standardization around the type of information to be submitted or how it's presented. So the result is, as we found, that for many existing or proposed EIA projects, the publicly available data is still limited or piecemeal. And where there is any, it's often based on a variety of assumptions, making it difficult to properly understand. And I guess it's worth mentioning briefly that carbon impact information is not only available where the planning scheme requires it. Some government departments and many companies are increasingly requiring it as a matter of course on their tenders and under their contracts. So as a result, some project owners do have a really good understanding of the carbon impact of their projects. But unfortunately, there's no requirement for such information to be proactively published. So even where it may be there, it's hard for us to get hold of it, and it didn't really help to close the information gap. So I guess overall, the challenge is that publicly available embedded carbon data is not really likely to exist for the majority of new projects, as there's no legal requirement for it to be provided. And even for those larger projects that are subject to an EIA, where climate impact information does need to be provided, the data can be difficult to find or use because it's generally inconsistently presented and based on multiple assumptions. And these are the types of challenges we've been wrestling with in collating the data for our report.
Sounds like a really difficult job, but is there anything that we can see from the data? Is there any figures that you could give us at all?
Yeah, so I think as Stacey touched on, what's been really highlighted is the gaps in the data and the differences in how different organisations are scoping out their carbon data, different carbon factors used, which really made comparisons quite difficult when we were trying to compare this on a like-for-like basis for our benchmarks. So I think as a summary of where we got to, we had actual data for 9% of the projects in that list. We'd estimated data for 66%, and there was no data for the last 25%. So I think that gives an indication of how significant those gaps are and where we need to get to.
Yeah, that's quite a lot of data that's missing, which you would think would be there already. Is there an easier way for us to calculate and forecast the carbon in projects at all?
I wouldn't say necessarily easier because, ultimately the key for this is trying to get the data as proactive as possible. So the point of collecting it is to enable us to make much better decisions in the future. So we use the benchmarks, or we'll be able to use the benchmarks to help focus planning and policy decisions and infrastructure development decisions based on the information that we've been able to capture from what's gone before. At its heart, measuring capital carbon is a relatively straightforward process. I say relatively, there are some catches to it, but you essentially take the quantity of the material that you're using, robust conversion factor as you find, and this helps. Other people have done the research into the carbon associated with the materials that you want to use and the methodologies you're going to use them by. And hey presto, you have your carbon footprint. But the catches to that is quite often to get all that information, you're a long way down the construction pathway. So you've decided on the option that you want to put in place. You've created the budget, you've started the procurement process, the detail is developing and evolving. So importantly, and it means a lot of the carbon opportunities for reduction have gone away or been missed at this point. So the measurement of data, however, if you can start capturing it, and this is where enabling quite optimistic with the evolution of digital tools here and a digital approach to design and capturing construction information. will allow us to create benchmarks, and by generating some transparent data, you start to get an idea that if you want to relieve a bottleneck in the transport system, if you want to increase transport capacity from one way to another, you can start to get an idea of what it's going to take in carbon-wise, in carbon expenditure to do that, and that starts to highlight more proactive decisions that we can make. And yeah, like I said, very optimistic digital tools are going to enable that much more for us.
Dominic, from the Carbon Trust, what is the bigger picture? I mean, how do we come together to progress solutions?
So I think that, the reason we started this project is that we had the sort of rule of thumb estimate that if you've got a £600 billion pipeline, if you use a really rough conversion factor, so converting £1 million of spend into tons of carbon, the estimation was that this pipeline is equivalent to 0.1% of the remaining global carbon budget. So in other words, the infrastructure we're going to build just in the UK is 1,000th of the remaining global carbon budget. So that was worrying, and so this is to get some more accurate numbers. But what we've realised is that the data isn't currently there and the approach isn't there. We've heard Yannick talk about his top-down approach from the ICE work, the ICE work, which is fantastic. We tried to do a bottom-up using a pipeline, and we can't get the baselines that we need. And as David says, what gets measured gets managed, and the whole point of measuring this is so as to make better informed decisions. And then we want to really overlay over the top of that past 2080. We wanted to start this right at the start of the concept design of these projects. We want to look at opportunities to build nothing, build less, build clever, build efficiently, so that we can actually remove carbon at source. And I think, what we found from this is that if you can't get a baseline, then you can't set targets. And so this is why this project's been really important. At the same time, we've realised that the sector hasn't got targets either. So we're trying to bring the sector together. So from all the different sectors, the economic subsectors, and basically trying to think about how could we, once we have this baseline, the next step is what targets could we develop and deliver. So we've looked across the industry. We've seen that in the buildings world, an initiative led by the UK Green Buildings Council, the Advancing Net Zero framework, that's been very successful and it's getting widely adopted. And we think we need something like that, a net zero infrastructure framework for infrastructure sector as well. And the reason why we need that is because everyone in the value chain, we've talked about everyone from the asset owners through to the main contractors, engineers and designers, the suppliers, everybody wants to be part of the solution. And if you can have a target framework that you can work within and deliver, then you can say you're part of the solution and not the problem. So we've come together. We think we've got an approach that might work, but we know there's no point in just us sort of saying what we think what's worked. We've got to bring everybody with us. And so we're just starting on that journey, and that's going to probably be the next phase of work for the coalition, is that we need everybody's buy-in. The key thing, and I've mentioned this already, I think, is that the infrastructure sector is not homogenous. Whether you're in the building transport infrastructure, whether it's road, rail, or etc., or whether you're in the comms, digital, and you're with fixed line or broadband, they're very different, and you've got everything from water and waste in between. So what we need to do is bring everybody with us. We've got an idea about how we would do it, and we're pulling that together, and then we're going to seek how we can fund such a large outreach into the sector, and that's really the next step. So I think we've all agreed we need a net zero target for the whole sector. Getting it right will potentially make the UK a global leader in this area about how to set net zero infrastructure targets. And that means we can start to help other countries as well on this journey. And ultimately, if we get this right, then you can start to direct private sector capital flows into delivering this solution for the world.
That sounds really good. That we could be in a really good place with that, actually. But will the planning framework change though, and will there be a planning requirement to provide data or carbon data in a standardised manner? Stacey, is that something you could talk to us about?
Yes, certainly I'll take that one. Well, I guess as we aim towards net zero carbon, the winds of change are certainly blowing in the direction of greater scrutiny of the carbon impact of new infrastructure. And in the context of the planning regime, we've seen examples of this in practice. For instance, the Planning Inspectorate recently asked Vattenfall for a life cycle carbon assessment for its new offshore wind project, and that assessment included data on the embedded carbon related to the project. And also the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, its Environmental Impact Assessment Guide to Climate Change Resilience and Adaptation, and it's working on a revised version of its greenhouse gas emissions impact assessment to reflect evolving practice. And this is likely to include more detail on embedded carbon issues. As many of you will also be aware, the government has indicated that in its forthcoming planning white paper, it intends to design a quicker, simpler framework for assessing projects' environmental impact, and that white paper is expected this autumn. And it's an opportunity for the government to be more robust on the problem of embedded carbon and to specifically require an embedded carbon assessment for each new EIA project. It would also help for the government to require more standardization around the way in which such carbon-based information has to be presented. That would allow the data to be more easily understood and compared across projects to identify the best practice. For non-EIA projects that do not currently have to submit detailed carbon data, a carbon analysis could be required for all projects requiring permission and even for all permitted development projects. However, this would likely be a difficult time and cost burden for smaller developments to bear, an additional regulatory burden, which in my view is contrary to the government's deregulation agenda. So I guess therefore, although it's theoretically workable, I'm struggling to see that's the pathway that government will go down. However, of course, that does not mean that such projects will not have to be mindful of carbon factors. As we know, the UK is hosting the next UN Climate Change Summit, COP26, in November, and we're likely to see them introduce new legal mechanisms and policies to encourage decarbonisation later this year and early 2021. As Dom says, that's as it aims to establish itself as a global leader in terms of reducing climate change risks. And those mechanisms might be by way of carrots or by sticks, or perhaps more likely a combination of the two. But also, if you look beyond legal regulation, there are significant social and financial pressures building on all companies to understand, to be accountable for, and to improve the carbon footprints of their businesses and projects. For example, financial institutions are increasingly requiring companies to disclose their decarbonisation strategies, and many consumers are actively favouring companies with lower carbon credentials and products. So these sort of direct and indirect pressures on companies are motivating them to develop strategies to decarbonise their processes and their supply chains. And for many in the infrastructure sector, that includes how to reduce the embedded carbon in their products, their processes and their projects. So as an industry, we certainly have the capability and the tools to materially reduce the embedded carbon costs of new infrastructure. For instance, I guess a substantial deployment of carbon capture and storage and low carbon hydrogen in the manufacturing of steel, concrete and other building materials could have a significant impact on the embedded carbon of many new projects across the UK. So, I suspect we will in the near future see increased planning-based legal requirements around reporting on the carbon impact of projects and greater standardisation, but perhaps only in relation to EIA projects. In contrast, I think I expect we're likely to see increased voluntary rather than legally required carbon reporting in the planning for non-EIA projects, but not for permitted development. However, I really don't think the non-EIA or permitted development projects will be able to avoid assessing carbon impacts. I think there will be other legal and non-legal mechanisms coming in the next few months, which will force such projects to take account of climate impact and in particular embedded carbon. So, businesses ought to be thinking about embedded carbon now, and that's why, as a coalition, we're raising awareness of the importance of embedded carbon when considering climate issues.
Can I add a couple of bits on that? Just in terms of what you can do with the carbon data that you've already got as well. I think one thing that's key is that you don't just see it as something that you gather internally for your projects or for your own organisation and then that's it. If you can link up with initiatives like this or with higher level metrics that are being maintained, for example, by the Institution of Civil Engineers as a result of the update on the infrastructure carbon review, the more data that we can have access to for these kinds of initiatives, the easier it is to construct a better, bigger picture of what's going on here in carbon terms. The only way we're going to know ultimately if we're on a pathway that's consistent with the Paris Agreement is by gathering this data together. Whether that's sort of new initiatives like the Supply Chain Sustainability School, or gathering a lot of data from partners when they're in a coordinated way in a platform and so on. These types of things, when we start getting that data gathered routinely at a very granular level and then reporting it back up in more aggregated terms, that's when we can start to think, okay, are we making the kinds of reductions that we need to be making?
I would like to add one as well, please, Dilly. Just Stacey, what you say is quite right about the smaller projects finding this potentially as a burden, but I would hope we can unlock that they can realise cost savings through doing it. I mean, for example, once you've decided on your options and you start developing that, in principle, the reduction of capital carbon will be, trying to strip materials out, deliver what you're doing more material efficiently, or trying to reduce construction site on work. Those are your two. If you can unlock those two, then hopefully increased cost in your development process will be realised, many times over. And also, I hope with more companies doing this, anyway, those costs are not hopefully are not hopefully a burden for the smaller schemes in developing their approaches.
So I guess finally, I want to ask, where do you see the role of the coalition in support of net zero carbon in infrastructure? So, where are we heading?
I'll close that one out, Dilly. So yeah, I think obviously we've heard lots of challenges that we've found. I think that the biggest issue that we want to tackle as a coalition is the fact that we have a very transactional economy, transactional way of working. So A decides to do something, gets B to look at it, gets C to build it, and then D uses it. And then this transactional approach is very difficult for us to make these significant carbon savings, for us to understand what we've got, where we're moving forwards. And what we want to move towards is a much more collaborative economy. Whilst we know that circular economy is the dream, that's very, very difficult to do unless globally we are circular economy. We can move to this intermediate state of collaborative economy. And that's what we really want to be involved in. So as a coalition, we've come together, whilst some of us are competitors, and we may not always want to share everything. We all have to get to the same goal. So we've heard a lot about the data and the big gaps that we have in that some projects have a lot of data and they're able to forecast, other projects have very, very little. And sometimes during this project, I think Natalie will agree, myself and Natalie did a lot of the data circulation, and it was very much an uphill struggle, very difficult. So it was a big challenge. But what we've also found in the process, I think, is in talking to people and talking to the asset owners, is there's a big enthusiasm. There's a big want for the organisations and people to achieve this net zero. There's a lot of people that want to be in that state of not impacting the climate, not jeopardising the future of what's happening globally. Yet the knowledge isn't necessarily there. So we found some people are much further along on their journey, especially when it looks at collecting data during a project and detailed design. Other people are, we really, really want to do this, we just don't know how. And I think that's where it's really key that as a coalition we can come in and support that journey, because so often the budgets aren't there right at this really early stage Dominic was talking about build nothing and build less. And that's the stage where they're on their own. We're not often brought in as consultants and contractors and organisations till later on, till they've already decided to build. And as a coalition, I think we can support that. So we've talked about the net zero, getting standardisation. If everybody knows where they're setting off from, if everybody knows what their expectations are, they can set their own resources, they can understand where the journey is instead of this scary target way off into the future that seems like it's unachievable. I think it's also another thing to look out for is that the Committee on Climate Change is publishing its recommendation for the 6th carbon budget in December. And this is the budget which provides government ministers with advice on what the greenhouse gas is and essentially our carbon budget for 2033 to 2037. So this is medium term, I'd say, if we're looking towards 2050. And it's really important that we know how we fit into that. What we've seen is cumulative emissions of pipeline of works for infrastructure isn't fully understood by industry and the planning system. And when we've got increased build rates, build back better, we're currently coming, in this COVID crisis and coming through potential recession issues, we may find that there's an increase on carbon emissions and carbon spend. So I think, in summary, the UK industry has made really big steps forward. We've got the infrastructure carbon review, we've got the carbon budgets, carbon management systems such as PAS 2080, as Dominic mentioned. What I really feel is, as a coalition and across the infrastructure sector, is that we can really step this up a gear across the whole supply chain and make it a priority, make it as urgent as possible.
Can I add a couple of points just on that scale and the budgets part there? I mean, just if you're sitting there thinking, well, what's going to happen to highways in the next 10 years off the back of this? The last 10 years we cut infrastructure carbon emissions by about 3% a year. We've got to do it by more like 4% a year every year for the next decade to be on the trajectory that the Committee on Climate Change has set out. And so that means you need a transformation in highways that was more radical than the transformation we've seen in energy in the last decade. So, that's a time where we quadrupled renewables, halved fossil fuels, pretty much took coal off the grid. Now we're talking about areas like transport and waste and water. They have to have similar transformations over the next decade. So it's going to be an enormous challenge and an enormous change. And if capital carbon isn't central to that, then we're going to find it very difficult.
I agree. Thank you, Yannick, for that information. And thank you today for all our panellists being here with us. And I hope you, the audience, have learned some really key information from this. But if you have any questions or would like any further information for what you've heard today, please do use the chat function, get in touch with our panellists, and let's take this conversation away and continue this after Highways UK. So thank you all very much for joining us. Bye.